Hello, welcome once again to Lehto's Law. I'm Steve Lehto. Today we're going to talk about the top 10 things that are not in the Constitution. Every time I mention the Constitution or anything that appears to even remotely go near the Constitution, people in the comments will lecture me about things that are in the Constitution, and it's surprising how often they're wrong. So there's a lot of stuff that's not in the Constitution that people think mistakenly is there. And of course, there's a lot of stuff in there that most people are unaware of. But today we're talking about the top 10 things that are not in the Constitution. You may have heard of some of these. You may have heard of all of them. But it's a refresher then. Number one thing not mentioned in the Constitution, God. Capital G-O-D, God. The word God does not appear in the Constitution. And the only reference to a deity at all in the Constitution is in the signature line with the date. It says, in the year of our Lord, and it gives a date. And at that time, year of our Lord was simply another way of saying AD or Anno Domini, which of course is nowadays Common Era. For those of you who don't like that, I just said that to trigger you. So the word God, the name God, the entity that is God, nowhere to be found in our Constitution. Number two, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. I've mentioned this one before because it's so commonly told to me that the Constitution's main point is that it guarantees us all life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And of course, that comes from either a really bad movie or the Declaration of Independence. And in the Declaration of Independence, they do in fact talk about life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. But the Declaration of Independence is not the Constitution, and in fact, it's not even really a legal document at all. What you might be thinking of is, if you're thinking that I'm still wrong on this, is that the phrase life, liberty, and property is mentioned in the Fifth Amendment to the Constitution as things that cannot be taken from you without due process. It wouldn't make sense to have happiness in there because no one can take your happiness. But life, liberty, and property are mentioned in the Constitution, but life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness is a different document altogether. Number three, and this is an unusual one, but the size of the Supreme Court is not actually described in the Constitution. The Constitution itself in Article 3 describes the court system and talks about there being a Supreme Court, and it describes some of the things that the Supreme Court will do. And it does say that the Supreme Court should be presided over by a Chief Justice, and that it will then be comprised of some judges or justices who will then sit on the Supreme Court with the Chief Justice. But there's no mention of how many people that would be. And of course, we know that nowadays we've got 9 justices on the Supreme Court, one of whom is the Chief Justice. And believe it or not, over the years, at one point it was as low as 6, and someplace else told me that it was as high as 10 at one point in time. I think it probably took a few years for us to figure out you don't want an even number of justices for obvious reasons. Can you imagine 10 justices and you have a 5-5 tie? But the size of the Supreme Court is now set by law. It's a United States Code 28 U.S.C. 1 is what describes that there are going to be 9 justices on the Supreme Court, again, one of whom would be the Chief Justice. Number 4, things not mentioned in the Constitution, and I've heard this one before, paper money, actual bills like the $100 bill that may or may not be behind me someplace. The Constitution says that the government has the right to coin money, and it uses the word coin as a verb, meaning to coin money. And some people over the years have said, well, you don't coin dollar bills, you print dollar bills. And some people have taken that to mean that the government has no right to print money. But the government does print money. Most of us enjoy getting money. We spend it also, but I've had people say, well, Steve, but paper money is all just a facade. It's not even constitutional. Well, the courts have looked at this, including the Supreme Court, which now is comprised of how many people? Okay, 9 people. They've looked at this, and they've determined that the right to coin money also meant to simply create money. But as of right now, it's not in the Constitution, paper money, but it's considered to be lawful. Okay? Number 5, things that are not in the Constitution, and this one is one that I think actually is the most troubling, at least of the 5 we've gotten to so far, and that is the idea of primaries. You know that we're going to have an election coming up in a couple of years, and around election time, preceding the election, will be primaries. And there'll be some people traveling the country, trying to get us to vote for them, and there'll be a big group from each party, most likely. And then as they go through the primary process, that group will get narrowed down till eventually you have one candidate from each of the major parties. And then you got a couple candidates from parties that no one's ever heard of and they have no chance of winning. But the point is that this whole primary process, primary elections, did not come from the Constitution. The Constitution just simply says who can be elected to office, and it talks about allowing people to vote, but it never says, by the way, you should actually have this primary process to determine who gets to run in the main elections. The Constitution is actually silent on a lot of topics, and this is one of them, where over the years it's just developed and become what it is. It's considered lawful, but it is not enshrined in the Constitution. Number 6, and this is one that I remember hearing this, and this phrase that people throw around is the right to privacy. The right to privacy. You might believe you have a right to privacy. You might think you have a right to privacy granted to you by your creator, whoever your creator might be, but the right to privacy does not exist, at least not in the Constitution explicitly. Now, you may have heard that the right to privacy is something they talk about when they're discussing certain legal issues like abortion or marriage and things of that nature. And if you've ever read Roe versus Wade, which as an opinion is quite thick, in there they talk about the penumbra of the various rights that you have in the Constitution. And it points out, and the argument goes something like this. There's a bunch of things in there that talk about things that sound like privacy. There's a law called the Quartering Act during the time of the Revolution, where the British soldiers could just say, hey, we're staying in your house tonight. And you had to let them do that. And of course, we have in our Constitution that they cannot do that anymore. That's specifically not allowed. And there's a couple other things in the Constitution and the Bill of Rights that suggest that we like our privacy. But nowhere does it say, oh, and by the way, Bill of Rights Amendment number 7.5, you have a right to privacy. It does not say that. So the right to privacy is something that most people believe they have. They want to have it, but it is not a constitutional right per se. Number 7, a right to travel. I challenge you, and if you want to, you can do what I did. Copy and paste the entire text of the Constitution into a Word document and search it for the word travel. The word travel does not appear anywhere in the Constitution. Now, some courts have said that you have a right to travel, and they get there by just saying similar to what they do with privacy. They go, well, it's understood that you can go from state to state and you can move around and your freedom cannot be restricted. Therefore, you have a right to travel. But nowhere in the Constitution is there a right to travel. So whenever you hear somebody say, oh, by the way, I don't need a driver's license or whatever, I have a right to travel, it's in the Constitution. No, you might have a right to travel, but it does not come explicitly from the Constitution. Number 8, a jury of your peers. And this is one I get asked a lot about. People say, Steve, if I'm put on trial for something and I'm entitled to a jury of my peers, does that mean they can just grab 12 people off the street and have them sit in judgment of me? Because what if I'm in an area and the demographic makeup is unlike me for whatever reason? Shouldn't they go out and try to find 12 people like me? Isn't that what a jury of my peers means? Well, the problem is that trial by a jury of your peers is not in the Constitution. What's in the Constitution is references to a trial by a jury and a trial by an impartial jury and some other things that talk about your rights as an accused, but nowhere does it say jury of your peers. The concept of a jury of your peers comes back from the old days, common law, across the pond, the other people who speak English. And the jury of the peers comes from over there, and at the time that became a popular saying, it had more to do with what social class you came from, because they had, these divisions where they've got like the king and all the various, or queen and all the various, people with titles, and then you've got other people, and you've got these, serfs down at the bottom. I'm joking, but a jury of your peers, like I said, is not something guaranteed by the Constitution. Simply, you're entitled to an impartial jury to be tried by. Number 9, the flag is not mentioned in the Constitution. Again, word search it. The word flag is not mentioned. So we do have a flag. Go into any courtroom, you'll see a flag. Go into any schoolroom, you see a flag. Go into most government offices, you'll see flags. A lot of flags appear on uniforms, whether it's military or police. And the flag, of course, is ubiquitous. But the flag is not mentioned in the Constitution. And, it doesn't mean that we're not entitled to have one. But it's just interesting that people make such a big deal out of the flag without realizing that, well, it is a flag, but it's not mentioned in the Constitution. So that's just, a little tidbit for you. And then number 10 on the list, and this is one that comes up quite a bit, separation of church and state. Separation of church and state does not appear in that manner in the Constitution. Now, Thomas Jefferson is often credited with coining the phrase, or at least pushing the idea of separation versus church and state. Other people have said you should build a wall between the church and the state. That sounds a little more, I don't know, distant. But of course, if you look at the First Amendment, the First Amendment says that the government cannot establish nor prohibit a religion. So in other words, the government can't say this is our official religion. It can't do that in violation of the First Amendment. It also can't prohibit any particular religions. So in essence, the government is staying neutral on the position of religion, except to say you're free to worship whatever you want to worship. And I think freedom of worship is one of the things that they often coin that as. But the point simply is that the idea of the phrase separation of church and state, that's not constitutional in that sense. It's an idea that people extrapolate, but it's not actually in the Constitution in that way. So once again, from the top, number 1 is the fact that God is not mentioned in the Constitution. Year of our Lord is mentioned in passing at the signature line, but that's obviously a reference to the date and not an establishment of a religion. Number 2, life, liberty, and happiness, not in the Constitution, but life, liberty, and property is. Number 3, size of the Supreme Court, believe it or not specifically mentioned, although today it's 9 based on a statute. Number 4, the right to print money, not in the Constitution, but the right to coin money is. Number 5, the idea of primaries in the election process, not in the Constitution. Number 6, a right to privacy, explicitly, not in the Constitution. Number 7, a right to travel, not in the Constitution. Number 8, a trial by jury of your peers, not in the Constitution, just a trial by a jury of impartial jurors. Number 9, the flag is not in the Constitution. And number 10, separation of church and state in that statement, in that manner, not mentioned in the Constitution. So in my mind, those are the 10 things not in the Constitution that you should be aware of. If you want to mention some more of your own, feel free to in the comments. Talk to you later. Bye-bye.